And here we have this beautiful facade. I could look at this one for a long time because there's so much going on here. There's so much more than initially meets the eye. And first thing that pops in my mind is this gradient. You know, like we have the plaster here with some color which has been faded probably after who knows how long, right? And then you get this gradient from top to bottom. And what this gradient's doing is pretty much just desaturating the color, right? It's not making it darker. So let's see. If you remove the saturation, you will see that this gradient is only very, very subtly darkening the base color. So this is a common mistake that people make when they're making this kind of gradient or this kind of like weathering, is that they make it darker. And of course, sometimes in a lot of situations, the weathering makes the base material darker. But in this case, it doesn't. So just keep this in mind. This is a really cool effect you can achieve, especially with stylized art. You know, you can have like a nice colored plaster, but then you have this gradient on top that's discoloring that base color you have. So let's put it back here. And let's zoom in here because this is an interesting one too. As you can see, the water leaks here, they have a negative space too. And it's very common in games to just make the positive space, right? Like the dark. You know, like most games they would just put some leak here. But this is of course much harder to simulate because all these gradients and leaks, they're interacting with each other, right? But just keep this in mind. Sometimes you need to have this kind of leaks. You know, they're not just the dark part, but also some parts the water doesn't run, so it doesn't get as discolored as the other parts. Or actually it might be the other way, right? Maybe the water doesn't run here, and then after so many years it gets dirtier where the water runs. And this is a common thing that you can notice in other parts too, like here for example, right? Like the build-up, the dust build-ups in the dark parts, of course, but then you got like these edges, you know, like these grooves where the dirt doesn't. So this is just some nice variation that you can have. You know, like here I imagine is because maybe this is from pollution. You know, I'm just taking a guess here. Maybe this is from pollution, and maybe here it rains, like the rainwater hits more than here, so it washes off some of that dust. And here's another example of the negative transparency I was talking about. It's very common in games to just put the grime, you know, the darkening, the leaks right under the pipe. But what we notice here is actually the pipe is the only part that there is no grime. And of course, like you can find pipes, you know, with the grime behind. I'm just showing one example here of this kind of weathering. So you really need to study really well whatever you're making, you know, like even if it's stylized, don't just rely on concept art, you know, like find pictures that are similar and study them, you know, like you're gonna there's so much we can learn from this, right? Like how the edges get brighter here because they're cleaner, right? Like in stylized art, a lot of times people, like we are just adding like edges for, you know, just for the sake of it. But if you pay attention, not every edge is highlighted. And this creates a nice visual interest. You know, if everything was highlighted, it just looks busy. But when you have this kind of rhythm, you know, like where some parts, the edges are brighter, but not in other parts. And how you're gonna implement this? I mean, like, I'm not saying you're making this specific wall, right? But this is just the kind of thought you can have while you're painting a texture or a mask. Try to think about all this, you know, directional information. And wood always looks cool. There's a weathered wood. I have quite a few pictures of doors, and I noticed that they always have this very discolored top, which not only is a result of the roughness map, let's say, but also that part of the wood gets discolored much more than the part that's lower, right? Because it gets much less sun on the bottom than on the top. So it's not necessarily a highlight, but it's just the like the paint layer, you know, like of the wood being like washed off over so long. And the other cool aspect of this wood here is this one, the grime actually darkens a little. So it's almost like an ale, right? Like the wood gets darker over time. And if we remove the saturation, we can see this well. Like here is a mix of shadow, of course, but you can see how wood, when it gets wet, it behaves in a different way than this kind of colored plaster we have here. Okay, this one is one of my favorites from all the buildings that I saw, because there's so much going on here, and I think the weathering looks super pretty. The gradients, you know, like how you have this darker part, you know, and then here is very bright, and like this just gives this such an old feeling, right? Like it's very hard to tell if this has been unpainted for 10 years, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, right? I really can't tell. And let's see if we desaturate. So this grime actually darkens the base. And a lot of this grime here, I suspect it comes from pollution, because it comes from the exhaust from the buses, you know, and the cars. That's my guess why it looks like this. And if we zoom in here, like we got some really cool shapes, you know, like in the, like look how beautiful that looks. And you get so many layers of pollution and then dust and then rust, whatever, you know, like whatever is happening there. And here we can see the original colors too. Like, so this shows that this facade is very old, because the only part that still has saturation is where the sun doesn't hit. And here we still have a little bit of the original color. In some places like here. So actually it looks like it's the paint. You see the other parts, the paint just is not there anymore. It's really hard to tell from the picture. But this shows like the many layers of complexity you can have in one wall, right? So you can have these gradients from the grime, from the dust, from pollution, but you also get this very sharp transition from painted to the base concrete. Yeah, look at this. So this is a very nice thing to simulate, you know, like the layering of paint like this. And yeah, we can see more of that pollution from the side. And if I go to the next picture, we get a more modular grime. So this is a really cool example of how you can still add some grime, you know, like to a modular piece and not have it repeating so much. Because in the previous picture, the grime we saw was very specific for that door. But then here, like this is a repeating, and it worked really well because like it doesn't have any very recognizable shapes, so repeats very well. So that's one thing that you have to keep in mind when you're making tileable textures. You know, like there's always this desire to make it look as good as possible and make it as interesting as possible. And if you add too much of specific detailing, it's not gonna tile well. But this one is a great example of just the right amount, you know, and the right amount of similarity and difference too. But yeah, there's so much going on in this building. Like the more you zoom, the more you find. And it's a great idea to take pictures like this and study them well, because you know, like you can create smart materials in Substance Painter, you know, to simulate this kind of stuff. Very fun stuff to look at. And just before I go to the next picture, I wanted to point out the damage. You know, and a lot of times in games, this damage is like just the brick and a very thin layer of paint. But when you look here, you know, the bricks are mixed with plaster. So it gives this very specific look. Like here, for example. So moving on to the next picture. This one is a great example of discoloration. You got this nice brick as a background, but then you get all these gradients, you know, that are creating this discoloration. And here's the thing too, you know, like they are masked with the brick shape. And I don't see people doing this so much when they make bricks. And it's a very nice effect, you know, like some kind of discoloration only on the top part of the bricks. So imagine if this was in Substance Designer, you know, this would be a mask. And then you can mask out the inner parts. And you look how much range of colors you get here. You got some really saturated brick here, you know, and then this one is like a terracotta color. And then here is gray. So brick always has a lot of colors, right? Especially after so long. But it's also a balancing act, you know, to not make the brick too contrasty. And here you can notice that the bricks, they all kind of have the same value, but then different colorations, right? And if we remove the saturation, we can see this well. Like brick in general is very, how can I say, flat in terms of brightness. You can add a lot of variation in coloring, but be careful when you add, you know, that brightness variation where like one brick is really bright and the other one is really dark. It usually, of course, depends on what you're doing. Usually it doesn't look so good because of the way the lighting works in the engine. And another example of, you know, like all these layers of pollution and grime and leaks, you know, a lot of effects you can use with the AO. And again, like under the windows we got a different coloration, right? But we don't get those very like detailed leaks, you know, like very common that we like to do environment art. Here's a very interesting situation. So this comes from a wooden door. This is carved in wood. And then it was painted on top, right? And then it's so old that the paint peeled. And it peeled in a very interesting way. Paint is gonna weather differently, you know, in plaster or in wood or in metal. So something to keep in mind. And of course, not every wood is gonna be weathered the same. So that's why it really pays off to do this kind of studies outside. Because then you can find a new way, you know, to do weathering, to create some smart materials that other people are not doing. Because if we're all looking at what each other is doing, like our stuff is gonna look all the same. And also, you don't develop as much as when you do your own studies, you know. That's what a lot of classical painters or even 3D artists do, right? Like they practice a lot, like quick sketches. And I think in environment art is a little harder to do this because our projects take so long. So every now and then it's a good idea to do this kind of studies, you know. Even if you can even go ahead and try to make whatever you're seeing, you know, just for yourself. You don't need to finish, you don't need to polish, but you can try to make it as an exercise. You know, like this case, for example, we could just find some head online, you know, and just make the shapes real quick, displace this, and then bring into Substance Painter, and then spend a lot of time there, creating all the layering. Look at the thickness of the paint. And that's what gives those little edges from a distance. And yeah, this is a very beautiful door. Someone told me that Kraków is the city of doors, and I can see why, because I took so many pictures of doors. Okay, and lastly, this is my favorite one, like by far. This looks like something that I've always trying to do when I make this kind of texturing. And it just looks so painterly. Like I love this. We got this interesting shape, right? With the plaster, with the painted plaster, and the two tones, right? Like the white and the yellow. But then because of this shape, this weathering accumulated in a very interesting shape. You know, it looks very painterly. And when we get closer, is actually the paint peeling. So that was a pretty interesting thing to notice, because it looks like just, you know, like a water damage, like water accumulation, but you get the paint peeling here, but here you got the grime accumulating too. So very subtle difference, and probably one that you can ignore when you're making a texture. You don't need to go to this level of thought, but it pays off to understand, you know, like how those cool shapes are made. Because look how harsh this is. You know, if this was a mask, you can just have some sort of gradient, and then you multiply a grime on top, and then you do a contrast to make the mask sharper, and you can get this kind of effect like this. So yeah, this wall looks really awesome. Maybe one day I would like to make, you know, just a segment just to practice and try to replicate. But yeah, some leaks here. Lots of ideas for smart materials, for tiling textures. Amazing reference. So now let's talk about grime done well in games. And here is a concept art from Mirror's Edge. I don't know the name of the artist. This is an old picture I have. So, but I really like how he or she nailed, you know, the grime. It's very clean, but then you got this nice subtle grime on the edges, you know, and it helps to enhance the path, right? It makes you intuitively know that you have to walk this path. And here's some cool example too of, you know, like some little leaks here and there, and the nice gradient where the water would accumulate. Here's a picture from Mario Odyssey, and it shows this nice water accumulation, and the texture repeats very well, you know, like it has a lot of character, but also doesn't look repetitive, doesn't look too tiny. So just a great example of how you can balance, you know, the shapes to get a harmonious tiling. This one is from Kirby and the Forgotten Lands, and I just love how they nailed exactly what we were talking about now, about the pollution, you know, and the edges being where the pollution is washed off. Not necessarily a bright edge, you know, like a lot of artists, they would make this edge here too, like very highlighted, you know, but it's because this edge is coming from the pollution, right? Like from the weathering, that it's brighter, and not just because it's an edge. So just a nice variation that they created here. Here's another one from Kirby, and this one I would like to point out how they used the leak here, the grime, the weathering, as a way to help navigation. And it might have been conscious or unconscious, or maybe I'm seeing things where they're not, but it's interesting how, you know, like the plant is not creating grime, but you have to climb there, and it creates this kind of triangular shape that guides you there. So this is a great example of grime being used for gameplay. And as environment artists, we need to think about this, you know, like our art should help the player navigate, explore, and not get in the way. You know, if we make this too like dirty, it can get confusing, and then the player might even miss it. But just keep this in mind, like having some sort of flow, you know, when you create this kind of weathering too. Here is one from Dark Souls 3 that I think nails that gradient that we were talking about with the bricks. So as you can see, the brick has some coloration, right? But then it gets discolored by this gradient. And in this case, the gradient doesn't even match the shape there, but it doesn't matter. And also this is an older game, right? They had to make do with less resources, but they were they knew what they were doing, you know, like they were very smart with how they placed the grime here. And look at the darkness too, right? Like that we just saw in a lot of those buildings. You can see it here too. This nice layer on top. So another Nintendo game, but a great example of what I was showing before, of the layers of grime. And you know, this texture looks very convincing, and it's in a stylized game. And the artist did an amazing job with the water accumulation, and then some discoloration on the metal. So many layers. But yeah, great example. Another one from Splatoon, and on this one I would like to point out how subtle the weathering is, but it helps so much to make this more believable and pleasing. So at first glance this looks very I wouldn't say clean, but you know, like there's no weathering, right? But then when you get closer, you can see that there's some very subtle weathering there, you know, like looks like a rain damage. And here you can see it too, on this wall here. Very subtle, it's not drawing too much attention, but it's there, and it helps so much to make this look so interesting. And lastly, I would like to show an example that it looks a bit old school, right? And this is just some old picture, you know, that I found on my folder. It's very old. Like, I really like how it looks like. I think the textures look beautiful, but I'm just gonna analyze from the perspective of what we have been talking about. And one of the things that I would say to be careful, you know, is by just adding this dark grime everywhere, and especially on the edges, right? Because we just saw that the edges, usually that's a place where there's no grime. And I just found this example because this is how we used to do grime, you know, like back in the day. Just darken, you know, just add random like color burns and stuff. And this is from a very old environment. This is probably PlayStation 2 era, you know, and the rendering was very different. There was no PBR. So you kind of had to make things look more interesting, you know, by doing this kind of treatment. But I just want to point out, because a lot of people still do this today, and be careful, you know, like when you're doing this just for the sake of doing it. Like in this case, you know, the grime should have been even reversed in a way, right? Like there should be some grime here and here, but not here. And again, this is just an example I found. The artwork is very beautifully done. The textures look good, you know, and this is, I don't know what engine it is. I would say it's not even Unreal 3, but it could be Unreal 3, maybe from the Bloom. Yeah, it's probably an Unreal 3. But yeah, the grime is there, you know, it helps make things more interesting. But if you want to go the next level, you know, the extra level, you would take these things into consideration. So for example, I wouldn't put any grime here on the top. I would put only here. And we saw in some pictures that the grime follows the shape, you know, of the window, and it's kind of harsh, the edges. And here I wouldn't put any grime either, and then I would, you know, just have a nice gradient. Okay, so now I want to show you how I approached the weathering on the Spanish town, and I go much more in depth in the environment art mastery tutorial, but I can show some examples of how I was doing here. And you know, and after doing this study now, I would definitely go back and do some things differently. And by the way, the lighting is not baked properly, so you know, like never mind this kind of, you know, glitch that's happening here. But that's not important so much for what we want to talk. So I want to show you this. Is it this one here? The decal grime layer that I did here. So if we hide the decals, you can see how much they add to the scene. And I'm using this mesh here. It's just a mesh with this shape, and it has a decal layer, and then it fades at the bottom, on the edges, and I can scale it. The texture scales. You see, like the texture doesn't get stretched, the fade gets stretched, but the texture doesn't, because I'm scaling those UVs by the transform. And it's very easy to do in the material editor. You just have to add a multiply node in the UVs input and multiply that by the object size. That's it. And so if the scale here is 2, you know, the UVs are gonna be multiplied by 2. And you can use this to you know, make these transitions interesting. And especially from a distance, it helps a lot to make things look more grounded. Like, look how gamey that looks. But then once you add some gradients, things just look much better. Here's some other weathering that I think is a little random, but it works from a distance. Just I actually have to redo this because it doesn't even match the base material so much, but it's supposed to be like the plaster like grime. You know, the scale might be off too, but this is a stylized environment, so you can get away with some of that stuff. But if this was a photorealistic game, I would be more careful with that kind of grimes. And here you can see how the decal edges help. And these leaks as well, they really help make things look a bit more grounded. You see, like if you remove that leak, that is just floating there. And again, like this is not, the lighting is not baked, so if this was baked, I would have more AO there. But in Lumen, the AO is not very precise, right? It's a little blurry. So you still need to do this kind of pass when an environment is done. And these leaks here, I added mostly for stylistic reasons, because they don't make much sense. And this was consciously. I knew that they didn't make much sense, but I like how the shape looked. So yeah, these are just decals. And if you don't know what a decal is, it's very easy to find tutorials. If you get, or if you have the Environment Art Mastery, you can go to, I think it's one of the last chapters that I talk about set dressing and finalization. And here I'm just fixing this live. The scale feels much better this way. Like feels less cartoony, let's say. And because we have the thing at the top, I think it would be more leaky there, right? So I think this feels a bit more natural. And maybe this decal has too many streaks. I think I also need another decal with like a simpler shape. And by the way, I only used like 4 or 5 different decals besides the corner. So I got grunge 1, leak 1 and leak 2. I need to make more, that's not enough variation. And here using the leaks here, you know, like where the plants are, to help make that look grounded. And yeah, most of the other buildings is just using the same ideas. And it sucks that the light bake is broken right now, because it makes it a little harder to see this kind of stuff. And here's an example of the discoloration I was talking about. And this one was done with on the base color, on the overlay. I have it's called like an overlay texture mapped to the second UV channel, so I can have gradients like this. And again, this is something that I explain in the tutorial, but I don't have time to go too deep here. But I can show how the texture looks like. If we open, what is that one? So you see it's a blend shader, like a blend material, and I just have 2 plasters, you know, like a clean one and a more damaged one. And then I have this overlay that only mixes with one of the blends, so I can have peeled paint, like you can see here. And then this texture is mapped using the second UV channel. So here you can see the texture mapped like this. And this is basically just adding the color that you see there. And here just some, you know, basic grime like this. Yeah, so how they say, there's many ways to skin a cat, right? There is a saying like this. Grime, there is not a single solution, you know, for every case. You need to figure it out. Sometimes you need to put the grime on the tiling texture, sometimes on decals, sometimes as a smart mask, or if it is a prop you can just bake down. It's up to you, like you have to figure out how to do it. But I hope this video helped you to see these things that maybe were hidden to you, and now you can go outside, take pictures, use your eyes, study. You're gonna find some very interesting grimes and weathering that you can use in your work. You can add to your library to help you create your own style. So that's all I got today. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and see you in the next video. Hey, if you enjoyed this video and you're looking to step up your environment art skills, I invite you to check my environment art creation course, Environment Art Mastery. This is a massive course that took me more than 2 years to put together and contains everything that I learned about environment art creation after more than a decade in the games industry. The course contains everything you need to know to be able to come up with your own ideas and take them to completion by using an easy-to-follow process that breaks down the creative process in logic steps. This process can be used to create all kinds of environments, no matter the style, theme, or engine. If you want to know more, visit environmentartmastery.com or watch the deep dive video in my channel. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again in the next video.